Hello from Heirloom Books, 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. What might well be one of the most famous first lines of any work of literature was written in 1912 by a timid, German-speaking Czech lawyer from a secular Jewish middle-class family working at an accident insurance company in the city of Prague, which was then part of the highly diverse and what history has shown to have been largely overextended Austro-Hungarian Empire. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. What follows Franz Kafka's initial rhetorical gambit within this story is a fairly practical working out of the numerous challenges arising from the Ovid metamorphosis myth-like circumstance created by its central character's physiological transformation as set within an early modern European cultural context that had also produced the Cubism of George Braque and Pablo Picasso, in addition to the psychological theories laid out by the Austrian founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, the musical compositions of Catholic convert from Judaism, Gustav Mahler, and the ongoing influence of such 19th century figures as Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky and the philosophers Soren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. Having previously published a pair of prose works in 1909, the Metamorphosis is the second of two stories that Franz Kafka wrote following meeting a woman named Felice Bauer in the autumn of 1912, relative of the writer's close friend Max Brod, who would ultimately preserve Kafka's major works for world literature even after 90% of them had already been destroyed, and he'd been instructed by the author in a note stating, "Dearest Max, my last request, everything I leave behind me in the way of diaries, manuscripts, letters, my own and others, sketches, and so on, is to be burned unread." As explained by Philip Rava in the introduction to a 1952 modern library publication of Kafka's best-known stories, on the night of September 22nd of that seminal fall, Kafka wrote The Judgment in one sitting, remarking afterwards that during that long stretch between 10 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock the next morning, he more than once had carried his own weight upon his back. About a month later, Franz Kafka had also written The Metamorphosis and started work on a novel called America, the Missing Person, or The Man Who Disappeared, depending upon the English translation someone might choose. As explained by Max Brod in the biography of Kafka, published in German in 1937, the dynamic expressed within The Judgment was fairly clearly derived from the relationship of its author to his father. In the story, a young man named George Benjamin, who recently became engaged to be married and is caring for his ill and aging father following the death of his mother, witnesses a sudden rejuvenation of the older man, who then proclaims his son a devilish human being, announcing, "I sentence you now to death by drowning," with the execution of this parental command immediately being carried out when George bolts from the house and drops himself into the river across the road, whispering, "Dear parents, I've always loved you all the same." Max Brod further clarifies the circumstances existing between Kafka and his father when he describes a 48-page letter the author wrote to his parent in 1919, which begins, "You once asked me why I maintain I am afraid of you. As usual, I did not know how to answer you, partly because of this very fear I have of you, and partly because the explanation of this fear involves so many details that when I'm talking, I can't keep half of them together." Given the nature of the parent-child relationship, however, the letter was never delivered, instead being provided to its writer's mother, who, returning the document to her son, apparently had decided that some things might just be better left unsaid. Still, the depths of the family drama, as Dr. Freud would probably have termed it, are clearly apparent within the metamorphosis once Gregor Samsa, traveling salesman and breadwinner for his father, mother, and sister, had been changed into a giant bug, quickly becoming, like an unexpectedly chronically ill individual or accident victim, a burden which makes his close relations feel relieved when it is eventually removed by death. Like the beginning of Metamorphosis, America, or the missing person, or the man who disappeared, pretty clearly sets up what is to follow. As he entered New York Harbor on the now slow-moving ship, Karl Rossmann, a 17-year-old youth who had been sent to America by his poor parents because a servant girl had been seduced by him and born a child, saw the Statue of Liberty, which he had been observing for some time, as if in a sudden burst of sunlight. The arm with the sword now reached aloft, and about her figure blew the free winds. It's interesting that Kafka substitutes a sword for the lamp beside the golden door from Daughter of American Revolution, German, Portuguese, and Sephardic Jewish poet Emma Lazarus's poem, before joining the huddled masses yearning to be free on Ellis Island. But then the story moves further away from realism when Rossmann realizes that he'd forgotten his umbrella in steerage and leaves his luggage under the care of a shipboard acquaintance, gets lost below decks, and then brought to the ship's captain by a stoker he had met, and fortuitously finds his rich American uncle in conversation with the skipper on the bridge, who then takes young Karl under his wing before later rejecting him, sending him off to meet a pair of drifters, find and lose a job as an elevator operator, and then venture out following the long-standing advice of Horace Greeley to go west, young man, by responding to an advertisement for employment with the Theater of Oklahoma, losing his identification papers, and deciding to call himself Negro as a nickname, which the 2008 translator of the Random House edition, Mark Harmon, points out. Kafka changed 9 separate times in his manuscript from Leo during Jim Crow era within the United States, when lynching was still prevalent enough to have also inspired Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit as many as 3 decades later. Now, the real-life romantic relationship with Ms. Bauer, although serving as a catalyst for both a lengthy correspondence and considerable nocturnal literary creativity, ultimately resulted in 2 broken-off engagements and may have contributed in a Madonna whore complex kind of way to what Max Brod at least suggested could have been the unknown to Kafka illegitimate birth of a son with another woman, child who subsequently died young, in addition to some reported habits of frequenting houses of prostitution and regularly indulging in highly graphic pornography. By the beginning of the First World War, both the novels, The Trial and The Castle, had been begun, as had the short story In the Penal Colony, about a remarkable piece of apparatus which inscribes upon an accused person's body the offense he may have committed. During World War I, the majority of Kafka's other works were additionally undertaken, including The Great Wall of China, concerning the futile and piecemeal construction of that structure as an alleged barrier to marauding immigrant invaders, and An Ape's Address to a Learned Academy, as well as a piece called Investigations of a Dog. Shortly after the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month armistice ending the conflict in 1918, Kafka established a relationship with a married translator of his published works from German to Czech named Milena Jenskaya, but her reluctance to leave her husband eventually ended things between them, although she did continue to make Kafka's writing available in Czech even after the author's death, before ultimately joining an underground resistance group to oppose the Nazis during the 1930s and dying in a concentration camp, as also did Franz Kafka's 3 sisters. Nonetheless, by the end of his life in 1924, suffering from laryngeal tuberculosis, which made it virtually impossible for him to eat solid food, Kafka had established a stable domestic relationship with a woman named Dora Diamant. This was also at the time he wrote a story titled The Hunger Artist, about a carnival entertainer who starves himself for audiences until they lose interest in his act and he dies, admitting that he'd only performed his show because he had never been able to find a food which he actually had liked, and then being replaced by a ravenous panther which succeeded in bringing back the crowds. Now, it was the unique worldview of alienation within social bureaucracy, expressionist psychological distress, and the surreal isolationism of mass culture, which Franz Kafka conveyed within his writing, that served to make him one of only 2 20th century authors to have inspired their own adjectives, the other being George Orwell. The word Kafkaesque, according to the concise Oxford Dictionary, meaning having a nightmarish, complex, bizarre, or illogical quality, was probably mostly derived from the incomplete novels The Trial and The Castle. Within The Trial, twice made into major motion pictures, first by Orson Welles in 1962, and then again in 1993 with a screenplay written by Harold Pinter. A man named Joseph K. is arrested on his 30th birthday for a crime, the nature of which, like all human beings sentenced to death at the moments of their births, is never revealed to him, and he then must attempt to defend himself as a virtually helpless individual, lost without recourse in a labyrinth of seemingly arbitrary bureaucratic complexities under a never-wavering presumption of guilt. The examining magistrates, law books consisting only of pornographic images, and proceedings being held within courtrooms to which a defendant can be called at any time of the day or night that are hidden away in dilapidated, overcrowded, and hard-to-find attics from which egress is as difficult as entrance, like in an intensely claustrophobic anxiety dream, and with the only possible verdicts being either ostensible or indefinite acquittal, while the charges can always be reinstituted for any reason at any time. Following his arrest, being left free to continue his daily activities, Joseph K. returns to his job, makes required court appearances, establishes intimate relationships with a female clerk within the court, and later the mistress of the defense attorney that an uncle manages to retain for him, but then, after a year of prosecutorial persecution, is taken away to an abandoned construction site and executed by two agents of the court like a dog, as Joseph K., the accused man, observes, as if the shame of it must outlive him. With the castle, Kafka again took the subject of maze-like bureaucratic intricacies, but it seems to me that at least initially, as expressed within the definitive edition with an homage by Thomas Mann, written by, or translated rather, by Willa and Edwin Muir, it's the novel's protagonist, K himself, who, as a late-night traveler stopping in a strange village near a castle during a blizzard somewhere in Central or Eastern Europe, raises the story's beginning ambiguities when, there being no room in the inn, he is reluctantly allowed to sleep on a bag of straw near a fireplace, but then is awakened by a young man identifying himself as the son of the Castilian, asserting that anyone staying overnight in the village must have permission from Count West. Kay then responding to this by claiming, "I am the land surveyor whom the Count is expecting," adding that his assistants would be arriving the following day before turning over and going back to sleep. What then ensues seems to me, at any rate, in keeping with what Max Brod described as Kafka's rich sense of humor, at least initially, is a kind of dark comedy of bureaucratic confusion, commencing when a telephone call is made to a night clerk at the castle, and the young man with the face of an actor is told that no surveyor had been expected, but then is quickly called back by the apparently insecure, low-ranking official who'd been assigned to the overnight desk at the castle, and told that there could be a mistake. Under the possibility of that assumption, Kay is allowed to spend the rest of the night, and the next day ventures out to walk through the snow-covered streets of the town, continuing to assert that he had been summoned as a surveyor, mentioning this to a pair of twin-like strangers, Arthur and Jeremiah, who later that day Kay finds waiting for him at his lodgings, claiming to be his assistants, possibly due to an assumption on their part that they might subsequently become employed by the castle, even though openly admitting that they do not know anything about surveying. Not being able to distinguish between them, Kay announces, "I shall treat you as if you were one man and call you both Arthur." Kay is later given a letter by a young messenger named Barnabas, which purportedly had come from the castle official named Clam, informing him that the town's mayor would be his supervisor. But when Barnabas's sister, Olga, takes Kay to visit an inn where people from the castle congregate, and the barmaid there, Frida, who it turns out is the daughter of Kay's innkeeper, becomes jealous and starts flirting with Kay, letting him see Clam through a peephole, and then becoming Kay's lover and immediately ending her relationship with Clam as his mistress. Town's mayor later informs Kay that any summons for him must have been a mistake, but offers him a job as a school janitor. And after Kay unsuccessfully attempts to reach Clam at the castle, he returns to the school to discover that Frida has begun an affair with one of his two Arthur-called assistants. Kay makes additional attempts to gain access to the castle, obtaining a meeting with a secretary that produces nothing, and becoming acquainted with the son of a man who is married to a woman who claims to have come from the castle. But Kay merely succeeds in being offered to stay at a second inn rather than continuing to move back and forth between the rooms at the school when one or the other of them is not in use. Franz Kafka died on the 11th of June in 1924 without having finished his book. But, according to a publisher note in the Modern Library edition from 1958, the author had told his friend Max Brod that Kay would eventually die of exhaustion from his efforts to gain entry into the castle. On an allegorical level, to me at any rate, the village entered into by chance, the self-appointed role within it, the remote, inaccessible, and sometimes cloud-obscured castle, its aloof agent of the Lord, Clam, and a sense of universal indifference all resonate with a cosmic sentiment like that expressed by William Shakespeare's King Lear. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Within that context, castle seems to me to make complete sense, as do the Metamorphosis, the Trial, and so many of this writer's other stories that have come to characterize the Kafkaesque, reflecting the absurdly meaningless nature of human existence in a world, borrowing a phrase from countless motion picture trailers, that is fully represented in Franz Kafka's rescued from oblivion by Max Brod body of literary work. Finally, perhaps what is demonstrated within Franz Kafka's writing is what Sigmund Freud, in his The Interpretation of Dreams, observed was a symptom of a deeper understanding, something Kafka himself quite clearly asserted, stating, "The meaning of life is that it stops." I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.